After a relentlessly exhausting argument with his wife, Richard decided he needed a night away to clear his head. He called his wealthy friend, Paul, who owned a massive, sprawling multi-level home, and asked if he could crash on his couch. Paul generously offered him one of his 3 guest bedrooms. Paul's house was unusually laid out. The master suite was on one side of a long hallway, while all 3 identical guest bedrooms were lined up directly next to each other on the opposite side. Paul rarely used them. Richard took the first guest room, exhausted. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard a strange, shuffling noise coming through the drywall from the second guest room right next door. Assuming Paul was in there organizing storage, Richard tried to ignore it, but the rustling continued, growing more annoying. Richard got out of bed, walked into the hallway, and tried the door handle to the second room. It was locked. He walked across the hall and peeked into Paul's master bedroom. Paul was already in bed, reading a book. When Richard asked what he was doing in the spare room, Paul looked confused. He stated he always kept those 2 extra doors locked because he stored valuable personal items in them. He told Richard it was probably just the house settling and to go back to sleep. Richard returned to bed, but 30 minutes later, the silence was broken by a distinct, deliberate tap-tap-tap directly on the shared wall. It was immediately followed by the faint, muffled sound of a raspy voice whispering. Richard didn't hesitate this time. He ran back to Paul's room. Seeing the genuine fear in Richard's eyes, Paul grabbed the master key from his nightstand. They walked to the second guest room and unlocked the door. As the door swung open, a cold gust of wind hit them. The bedroom window had been forced wide open. The bedsheets were violently rumpled, bearing the distinct indentation of someone having slept there. Every drawer in the room had been pulled open, and Paul's valuable belongings were entirely missing. Before they could process the break-in, Paul suddenly realized the terrible truth. He sprinted out of the room and shoved his key into the door of the third guest bedroom at the end of the hall. Richard was right behind him as the door flew open. The room was in shambles. Just as they entered, a filthy man dressed in dark rags threw his leg over the windowsill, dropping down onto the lower patio roof and disappearing into the night. They didn't chase him. What they found inside the room paralyzed them. The pristine white bedsheets of the third guest room were heavily stained with dark, dried blood. Laying in the center of the closet floor was a large butcher knife, missing from Paul's kitchen, also spotted with blood. The terrifying reality set in. While Paul was living alone in his massive house, a group of highly dangerous, likely drug-addicted transients had broken in and had been secretly living inside his locked guest bedrooms for over a week. They had been sneaking downstairs to eat his food and sleeping just walls away from him. The intruders were never caught, leaving Paul to forever question the safety of his own home. For a 15-year-old, having a friend's house to yourself for the entire weekend is the ultimate freedom. Matthew had ridden his bike over to his best friend Anthony's house on a Friday evening. Anthony's parents were out of town, leaving the 2 boys alone to play video games and eat junk food late into the night. By 10 p.m., the video games had grown boring. Looking for a cheap laugh, they decided to make prank calls. After calling a few local pizza places, Matthew decided to just dial a random string of numbers to see who would answer. On the 4th attempt, the ringing stopped. A man with a deeply rough, gravelly voice answered, simply saying, "Yeah." Matthew, trying to hold back his laughter, asked, "Sir, would it be all right if I borrowed one of the wheels from your car?" There was a long, dead silence on the other end. The joke had landed flat. Matthew tried to regain his composure as the man finally spoke. "What's your name, kid?" the man asked. Matthew lied, "My name is Bob." Another chilling silence followed. Then the rough voice replied, "Really? You sure it's not Anthony?" The blood drained from Matthew's face. He looked over at Anthony, who was now visibly terrified. Matthew immediately slammed the phone down. Anthony's home phone didn't have caller ID set up to display his name, only his father's. There was absolutely no logical way a random stranger could have known Anthony's name that quickly. Spooked, The boys decided to sleep in the living room and put on a movie to distract themselves. But an hour later, the distinct metallic sound of the front storm door creaking open broke the silence. Someone was turning the front doorknob. The lock held firm, but the handle aggressively rattled. Matthew crept to the window and peeked through a slit in the blinds. Standing on the dark front porch was a very tall man. The man noticed the movement in the blinds and snapped his head, looking directly at Matthew. Matthew threw the blinds shut. The boys quietly retreated to the kitchen. Then, they heard the heavy wooden gate in the backyard swing open. Matthew's stomach dropped. He had parked his bike in the backyard earlier and had completely forgotten to lock the back door. He crept down the hallway to secure it, but he froze. Standing right outside the glass pane of the back door was a dark silhouette. The man opened the unlocked door and stepped right into the house. Matthew and Anthony silently bolted upstairs, rushing into Anthony's bedroom and crawling deep underneath his bed. A long fabric bedskirt shielded them from view, but they were trapped. They listened as heavy boots slowly walked through the first floor, opening every single door. Eventually the footsteps reached the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. The intruder was taking his time. The bedroom door creaked open. The man walked in. He opened the closet door, aggressively sliding the coat hangers back and forth. Then the heavy boots walked over to the bed and stopped directly in front of their faces, hidden only by a thin piece of fabric. Matthew clamped his hand over Anthony's mouth to muffle his heavy breathing. The room was dead silent. Assuming the man had left, Matthew slowly moved his hand away to whisper. Suddenly, a horrifying, blood-curdling scream erupted from Anthony as a massive hand shot under the bed, grabbed him by the shirt, and violently dragged him out into the open room. Matthew scrambled out from under the bed. Anthony was thrashing on the floor, struggling against the massive intruder. Desperate, Matthew grabbed a long metal screwdriver resting on the nightstand and drove it with all his might into the intruder's back. The man let out a roar of agony, dropping Anthony. The boys didn't look back. They sprinted down the stairs and out the back door, diving straight into the dark, dense woods behind the neighborhood. They hid behind a large bush, watching the house. A minute later, the bleeding intruder stepped out the back door. He stared directly into the pitch-black woods. Somehow he spotted them. He began sprinting toward their hiding spot. The boys ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping their faces, until they found a small depression in the ground and lay face down in the dirt. They listened as the heavy boots crunched through the leaves, stopping just a few feet away from them before finally turning and running off in another direction. They waited an hour before sneaking back into the house, locking the door and calling 911. While waiting for the police, Matthew turned on the backyard floodlights. Standing directly at the edge of the tree line, watching the house, was the tall man. As the lights hit him, he slowly backed into the shadows and vanished. He was never caught, leaving the boys forever haunted by the horrific consequences of a single, random prank call. A child's first sleepover is a milestone, filled with staying up entirely too late, eating junk food, and sleeping in unfamiliar places. For 10-year-old Chris, his first sleepover at his best friend Jordan's house was a night that would permanently scar his childhood. Jordan's house had a massive, sprawling basement that served as a playroom. The boys played video games until 1 a.m. before collapsing out of sheer exhaustion onto the basement couches, skipping their bedtime routines entirely. Sometime deep in the middle of the night, Chris woke up. The basement was nearly pitch black. The television had gone into standby mode, emitting a very faint, grayish-blue glow across the room. As Chris blinked the sleep out of his eyes, his gaze drifted toward the far, dark corner of the basement, near the wooden stairs leading up to the main house. Standing in the corner was a figure. It wasn't a parent coming down to check on them. It was a solid, impossibly tall, pitch-black mass. Chris couldn't make out any facial features or clothing, but the sheer size of the entity was terrifying. It was standing completely motionless, its head nearly brushing the low basement ceiling. Before Chris could even process what he was looking at, the television abruptly clicked completely off. The tiny source of light vanished, plunging the basement into absolute suffocating darkness. Chris was paralyzed. He didn't scream. He simply squeezed his eyes tightly shut, too terrified to even breathe, waiting for the massive figure to cross the room. He laid completely motionless for what felt like hours, eventually passing out from sheer terror. He was jolted awake hours later by a horrifying, blood-curdling scream. It wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from the second floor of the house. It was Jordan's mother. Jordan woke up, terrified, and the two boys sprinted blindly up the stairs toward the master bedroom. When they burst through the door, Jordan's mother was sitting up in bed, hyperventilating and crying hysterically. Jordan's father was frantically tearing the bedroom apart, looking for an intruder, before rushing out into the hallway with a baseball bat. He searched the entire house, but all the doors and windows were deadbolted from the inside. There were no signs of a break-in. Years later, when Chris brought the incident up to Jordan as an adult, Jordan revealed a chilling detail. His mother still refused to talk about that night, but she had confessed to Jordan that the reason she screamed was because she woke up to find a massive, impossibly tall, pitch-black figure standing silently in the doorway of her bedroom, watching her sleep. It was the exact same towering entity Chris had seen lurking in the dark basement hours before.